Making cold cast bronze custom drawer pulls. If you follow our Instagram page, you're probably well aware of this project. In this tutorial, we're going to cover the process of making custom cold cast bronze furniture hardware. And we'll be using the mold of a flower that we showed in a previous tutorial. This was a flower sculpture by one of my daughters that we reproduced in hard resin. And I figured as long as we had that mold, it seemed to lend itself well to making some custom hardware for her bedroom. So we're going to first remove some of the existing hardware. This is the existing drawer pull. And the first thing we'll need to do is find some matching screws to fit that at the hardware store. Obviously, we could drill those holes out to whatever size we need, but I wanted to make sure we could do this with as little modification as possible to the existing furniture. So here's some a bolt and a nut that we got from the hardware store. And what we're going to do is embed that in the resin cast so that we can then screw that hardware right in place where the old stuff was. Now, one of the things we'll need to do is we need to make a little rig here to hold that bolt in place while we're casting our resin so that it will become embedded in that final cast resin part. Now, the original mold was just made for regular resin casting with no special modifications, so I really didn't take this into consideration, so we're going to have to MacGyver this mold here a little bit to allow it to accept that hardware. And what I'm doing here is I had a silicone chunk left over in the bottom of a mixing bucket, and I just cut that down to fit the top of the mold. And I'm going to use an X-Acto knife to poke a little X hole there so that I can just push the hardware through and have the silicone hold it in place during the casting process. And this is by no means the best way to go about this, but this will just show you how you could modify an existing mold or adapt to a mold that you already have without getting overly complicated. And basically what we're going to do there is use that little silicone chunk to hold that screw in place while our resin is poured. And then, of course, once the resin solidifies, we can just slide off that silicone chunk and do it again. So it basically just acts as a little placeholder there. And also, to make sure it's in the right place, I'm going to use a permanent marker here to trace around that silicone plug and mark it there with a couple of little hash marks so we know where it goes. And that way, each time I can make sure that that screw is in approximately the same place on each cast. Now for this cold cast bronze, we're going to be using what's called the dusting method. And this particular method works best with very soft silicone molds. So our 7111 mold works great for this because it really likes to grab that bronze powder. And what you do is you basically pour out a little bit of bronze powder and then slosh it around. It almost behaves like a liquid when it's a very fine powder like this. So we're going to slosh it around and then pour it back out into that container again. And for larger molds, it really helps to transfer your bronze powder to a larger Tupperware container and then keep it sealed up when not in use so you don't get any moisture contamination in your bronze powder. But basically, you just slosh that around and check the inside of the mold if you need to, pour it inside again and pour it back out. And each time you'll notice the inside of the mold gets a little bit better coverage. And once you're done, just double check your work, make sure you don't have any bare spots in the coverage of bronze powder, and the inside just should look like almost like a fuzzy brown interior. And now you're ready to cast your resin. Now for this particular process, we decided to use our new TC800 resin. And this is a very hard casting resin. That's why we chose this, because it's a very hard resin and polishes really well. So it works very nicely with the cold cast bronze process. So the TC800 is a 75D hardness. It's a 1-to-1 mix ratio by volume, a 2-minute working time, a 10-minute, roughly 10-minute demold, and it's fairly low viscosity. And if you're doing larger pours, if you have larger cold cast bronze pieces and you like those physical properties, you can always use the TC803, which has a 6 to 7 minute working time. Now we're going to measure out about 4 ounces of resin for this particular piece. It actually only takes about 2.5 ounces of resin to fill the mold, so we have some other little silicone molds standing by to accept the rest of that resin. But it's always a good idea when you're working on a volume ratio in small amounts to not mix under about 4 to 6 ounces or so. When you start getting into very small amounts and trying to eyeball that, it's very easy to get out of ratio. So remember that when you start getting down under about 3 or 4 ounces, it's a good idea to switch to the weight ratio, which for this particular product is 100 parts of A to 88 parts of B. Now we're ready to add some color. And remember, you want to do this pretty fast because the clock starts ticking as soon as those two components go together. So we've added our brown polycolor pigment, and now we're stirring it up, and you have about a good 20 to 30 seconds to get a good thorough mix, and then pour your casting resin into your mold. And again, I can't stress enough, especially in the summertime, you want to move fast because that 2 minutes flies by when you're mixing and pouring and doing all these things at the same time. So once we've got that poured, ready to position our plug in place, and that jig will just hold that screw in place until the resin sets. And as you see, we got a little overfill there, but that's okay because we're actually going to use that little drip to monitor our progress on our casting resin. And once that turns solid, we know that we're ready to demold our part. So remember that casting resins like this set up from the thickest point and radiate out. So as soon as that thinnest section there, that little drip on the side, as soon as that turns solid, we know that the part inside is completely cured. And now ready to demold our part. And a cold cast bronze piece like this, before it's polished, is going to have the look of like a dull chocolate brown color. And that's okay. You're not going to see the shiny bronze until it's buffed out, because right now all of that bronze powder that we coated the inside of the mold with, all of that is encased in a very micro thin layer of casting resin. So we've got to abrade it slightly to pull that off. So first, while our resin is a little bit green, we're going to go ahead and clean it up with a razor knife here, trim off any excess, and then we're going to let that cure a little bit more, because anytime you've got a resin like this that you're going to be polishing on, especially a resin like this that cures really hard, you want to wait for it to get to its full hardness before you start polishing on it. If you start polishing too early, you'll find that you just go right through that layer of bronze and right to the resin. So it's real important to let it sit and cure to its full hardness so that it'll take a good polish. And now we have our rough cast piece, and it's ready to accept the little nut that we have to match up to it. So we're going to go ahead and put that in place and set that aside and let it cure up the rest of the way. And while that was curing, we cast several more of these, 8 in total. Now, if you know going into a project like this that you're going to be using it for hardware or something similar where you're going to reproduce a lot of parts, it's a good idea to make several pulls, plain resin pulls from the original mold, and then make a gang mold of 10 or 12 copies so you can cast them all at one time. And that both gets you more production out of a single mold and much faster production. Now, you're going to need some steel wool, some 4/0 steel wool to shine up these cold cast copies, and we're going to use some of the Sculpt Nouveau Verde wax to apply over the top to give the look of oxidized bronze. Now, the first thing we need to do is polish that surface with steel wool. And once these cure completely, you can actually polish these pretty aggressively and not worry about pulling off that bronze powder layer. And one of the important things there is, of course, that you use the 4/0 steel wool and not the 2 or 3/0 steel wool. 4/0 steel wool is just fine enough. You can polish it up and pull off any of the resin covering up the bronze powder, but it's not too harsh that you wind up just sanding through that layer of bronze powder. Now, once we've polished up the bronze and shined up the bronze powder, we're ready to add our wax. And you might have seen this used a lot in some of our previous videos. I just like to stipple this all over the surface of a cold cast bronze piece. Sometimes we also use the black and the brown wax as well, and even the green wax, which is more of a transparent green. But the Verde wax seemed like a good fit for this one. It's a very opaque, almost a mint green colored wax that really gives a look of old oxidized bronze. And I like to stipple that all over, let it sit for a little bit, and then wipe away the excess with a clean towel or a paper towel and pull off any of that excess wax. And it's important that you do that as soon as possible. If you wait too long, you'll find that that wax really bonds to the resin. So real important there to wipe away any wax that you don't want. Pull back the high points as soon as possible within about 5 to 10 minutes of applying the wax. Now, the final step is we're going to allow that metal wax to cure completely. The Sculpt Nouveau metal wax is different than, say, shoe polish, for instance, in that it actually dries and then cures. It has binders that help it really grab onto metal is what it's actually designed for, but also resin and wood and a lot of other surfaces. So once that wax has cured completely, I like to go back and polish it one more time with that 4/0 steel wool and just bring out some more of the bronze shine and pull back any remaining wax that I don't want. And now we have our finished cold cast bronze piece ready for installation. And the beauty of this kind of project is we took a sculpture by one of my children, and in just a matter of hours we were able to turn this around into usable furniture hardware and just something that makes your furniture extra special. In this case, we were able to upgrade her little armoire here with these custom drawer pulls, and they're special to us and special to her because she actually sculpted these parts. So there you have it, the process of making custom furniture hardware using TC800 resin for the cold cast bronze process. And of course, as you might have guessed by now, all of the products used in our video are available on our web store, so be sure to check out our casting resin page if you want to check out the TC800 casting resin. And of course, in our urethane additive section, you can find the bronze powder and any of the other urethane additives. And in the Sculpt Nouveau section, you'll find the Verde metal wax. And you can find all of that at Brick in the Yard Mold Supply. And for those of you who have been watching us on Instagram, you were probably well aware of this project and knew this video was right around the corner. We've been posting several pictures explaining this process leading up to this. So if you don't follow us already, be sure to check us out at instagram.com/BiddyMoldSupply.